Irwin Lowenstein is the founder and president of Rethink Advisors, a Cleveland-based strategic consultancy that lives at the intersection of purpose-driven urban design, planning, architecture, sustainability, and resilience. A registered architect with over 35 years of professional experience, Irwin earned his Bachelor of Architecture degree at Carnegie Mellon University. He is an EcoDistricts accredited professional and a LEED accredited professional. LEED stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. Irwin has special expertise working with clients in the nonprofit, governmental, and institutional sectors, where he closely collaborates with the leadership of anchor institutions, urban innovation districts, campuses, foundations, and mayors who are planning, building, and leveraging strategic investments. With a focus on legacy cities, Irwin brings cross-sector experience in urban design, planning, architecture, and development to realize large-scale redevelopment projects on behalf of his clients, which include Case Western Reserve University, Metro Health Systems, and the City of Lakewood. In 2011, Irwin began managing major capital projects for Case Western Reserve University, and in 2012, Barbara Snyder, president of the university, appointed him as the advising university architect, placing him as a trusted advisor to the president and the university board of trustees on matters related to planning, design, and construction. Irwin oversaw the development and implementation of the university's campus master plan, advised on the planning and design of the health education campus in collaboration with the Cleveland Clinic, and managed the design of the Nord Family Greenway, a major civic landscape project connecting the university and the surrounding neighborhoods with the cultural landmarks and institutions in University Circle, including the Maltz Performing Arts Center at the Temple Tifereth Israel. Irwin and his wife Heather, who's here, live in Shaker Heights and are the parents of 2 grown daughters. Please give a warm welcome to Irwin Lowenstein, who will speak on Cleveland Paves a Path to Building a Healthy Neighborhood.
So thank you, Helga. That was a lovely introduction from a lovely person. We're all very fortunate to have you in our community and playing this role. I want to thank my wife, Heather, for being here and for being my partner in everything that I do, supporting me in everything that I do, including everything that I'm going to talk to you about today. And thank all of you. It's so nice of you to be here. I admire you all for your interest in learning, something that I also am very interested in. So, roughly 7 years ago, I learned a lesson that changed my career path and the way that I thought about and approached my work. It actually changed how I see the world in a material way. It was a lesson both simple and profound, urgent and important. It's a lesson that's fundamental to how I come to stand before you today to unpack this question of how urban design impacts health. I've come today to share this important life lesson with you since it's key to my current work with Metro Health Systems and with leaders in the Clark Fulton neighborhood, where we are endeavoring to build a healthier neighborhood. I'll tell you about that in a moment. The lesson was a wise lesson offered to me with grace and humility, and it's a lesson I learned from a woman who I didn't know, I still don't know, and I met only for the briefest moment. I never got to thank that woman, but I'll never forget her, and I'll never forget the lesson. Before I share the life lesson, though, I need to first tell you a few things about me and how I come to this work. I always wanted to be an architect from the youngest age, and my interest in architecture and neighborhoods undoubtedly emerged from growing up in the Pittsburgh neighborhood of Squirrel Hill, a highly diverse urban conclave of moderate density, a robust mix of uses, historic buildings, and great commercial districts. And of course, it was a great place for a budding young architect to build a lemonade stand, I think my first project, with his younger brother, that's Steve on the right, in front of our house on Darlington Road. Here's my brother and I again 7 years later. Our family had moved to Cleveland, and this picture is at Fairmount Temple as Steve became a bar mitzvah. I have to tell you that although I consider myself a nice Jewish boy, my brother actually ended up becoming a rabbi. He's a rabbi in Chicago, that little boy right there. My parents, Marcia and Ben, were deeply engaged in our temple and especially in social action. I grew up with good role models of Reformed Jewish values, including community engagement and community organizing. So why these two photos? Is it to show you that indeed I once had hair? No? Well, okay, maybe partly. More importantly, these two photos represent two principal interests I've pursued in my life so far. Architecture and design on the one hand, and social action and social justice on the other. For me, these two strands were mostly separate paths, a vocation and an avocation. Overlapping for sure, but not fully integrated each with the other. I enjoyed both and found meaning and satisfaction in both, but I was an architect by day and a board member and community volunteer by night. But the lesson that I learned from a kind community elder changed that. So here's the life lesson. It occurred in Glenville, a Cleveland neighborhood many of you likely know, since it was from 1900 to 1950 or so, one of the principal and largest Jewish communities in our center city. At its peak, Jews in Glenville represented 90% of the total population of the neighborhood. Glenville, like similar neighborhoods across the country after 1950, experienced white flight. Jews and other whites moved to the suburbs, and it was transformed into a mostly black neighborhood. The 1960s saw civil unrest, and decades that followed saw erosion of the tax base due to a precipitous drop in population and significant disinvestment. Today, Glenville is 95% black. The median annual income is $21,600. The poverty rate is 41%, and nearly 70% are considered low income. 43% use food stamps. Sadder yet are the health outcomes in Glenville. The infant mortality rate in Glenville is 22 of 1,000. For comparison, that's the same infant mortality rate as in North Korea. The national average infant mortality rate is 5.8 per 1,000. So the infant mortality rate in Glenville is roughly 3.5 times the national average. Average life expectancy in Glenville is 72 years. But average life expectancy in Lyndhurst is 82 years. So 10 years of life expectancy in 10 miles. That didn't seem fair to me. I don't think it seems fair to you. And these tragic statistics are roughly the same in most Cleveland neighborhoods, including Clark Fulton, which I'll also tell you about in a moment. So 7 years ago, I was presented with the opportunity as the university architect for Case Western to assist the Glenville neighborhood in the development of their community master plan. Knowing something about the terrible health outcomes in Glenville, I thought surely, as a planner, I could bring my supposed knowledge about the connection between active living and better health outcomes. After all, I had studied all the active living professional literature. That's the urban planning concept that living near parks and parks with recreation and having things like bike lanes and sidewalks promotes physical activity, thereby reducing obesity and increasing health outcomes. That made sense to me. I knew that a common metric to judge alignment with active living was how many residents lived within a 5 to 10 minute walk of a park. So I prepared and presented a map that showed which homes in Glenville were located within a 5 or a 10 minute walk of a public park and where the city had installed bike lanes. The residents, all black, and many that had lived in the neighborhood since the 1950s or 60s, listened patiently and courteously. Me expecting a rousing conversation about these great assets in the neighborhood and using them to achieve better health outcomes, I was taken aback when at the end of my presentation, only one elderly woman raised her hand to make a comment. And here's the lesson. Mr. Lowenstein, she said, I live in one of the homes very close to a park and close to a bike lane, but I would never use either. The bike lane is too dangerous. It was not a protected bike lane. And most of the parks you show on your map are where the neighborhood drug deals take place and where the addicts hang out. I don't use those amenities because I don't feel safe there. For me, that felt like a crushing weight. I realized in that moment and countless moments that followed that every neighborhood is an infinitely complex organism where each element is a part of an interconnected system, and each system is designed to achieve the outcomes we get. Glenville was designed to get the outcomes that it gets. As a planner, breaking down each element and looking at them in isolation missed the whole point. The outcomes we get from historic systems, and many go back hundreds of years, based on policy and prejudice, are different from place to place. And for far too many, especially communities of color, it's unjust. I really wanted to understand how best to achieve more equity, more resilience, more parity, and more understanding. So I pursued training in race, equity, and inclusion. I pursued training in trauma-informed planning. These two life paths of mine started to become one. Once two strands, mostly separate, a vocation and an avocation, overlapping for sure, but not fully integrated. I enjoyed both and found meaning. Now I began to see how architecture and planning can be a form of social justice, one and the same thing. I also began studying the literature and the practice of environmental justice, which posits the notion that everyone, no matter where you live, should enjoy the same degree of protection from hazards and have equal access to the decision-making process to creating healthy environments. We have enough wealth and health in the United States. We just are not distributing it equitably. This resonated deeply with my own Reformed Jewish values, tikkun olam, chesed, and kavod. I began to understand that if we seek to achieve real, lasting, meaningful change in urban neighborhoods like Glenville and Clark Fulton, we need to think in complex systems. The interdependencies and intended or unintended consequences of every decision that we make. I began to understand that the root causes of our challenges cannot be addressed if we merely propose palliative measures dressed up to look like real change. And seeing the profound wisdom in the Glenville community and every community like Glenville, I learned that we need to include all those affected, the residents, those who understand the lived realities in the neighborhoods, in the decision-making and the governance, in meaningful and relevant ways, not just experts coming in to tell the neighborhood expert ideas. And this could not be coming at a more important time, these ideas. I knew, as an architect who was interested in sustainability, for 2 decades, I had been working on trying to manage overshooting our environmental and planetary boundaries. But what I didn't realize, and came to realize, is that we were significantly shortfalling the opposite side of our planetary boundaries. And that's our social foundation. And this has just as much to do with health and wealth outcomes in neighborhoods, or more to do than what I had been working on. Let's talk about health disparities. In the United States, we spend $3.3 trillion on health. That's 20%, almost 20% of the United States GDP. But the current generation is the first generation in modern times whose health outcomes are actually decreasing. We've hit that point where the current generation's health outcomes are decreasing. So tragically, our cities are designed to get these inferior results. So with renewed focus on this idea of the intersection between urban design and the extreme urgency in supporting our social foundations, as well as limiting our overshoot of our planetary boundaries, what have I learned about how health intersects with my profession, architecture and urban design? Have you all heard about the social determinants of health? This is a very important topic that is just now getting much more attention. Research now shows that our health outcomes are only impacted by our clinical care by 10%. Only 10% determines our health outcomes. So where you go to the hospital, who your doctor is, I know if there are any doctors in this room, they're the best in the city, but only 10% of health outcomes are determined, according to the World Health Organization, are determined by the medical care that you get. Another 10%, obviously, is based on your genetics, and that you can't change. 80% is actually determined by your physical environment, where you live, your health behavior. Do you smoke? Do you watch what you eat? And socioeconomic factors. Do you have a job? Are you living in poverty? So if we know that 80% of health outcomes are determined by the physical environment, socioeconomic factors, and health behavior, it logically concludes that health is actually determined by race. Health is actually determined by class. Health is determined by your education. Health is determined whether you have a job or not, whether it's a good job. And your health is actually determined by your zip code, where you live. And I could show you statistic after statistic that proves this out. I found this to be unjust. It really resonated with me. It made me realize that as an architect and urban designer, we need new models. We can't keep planning our neighborhoods the way we've been planning them. And we can't not look at the hard truths of why our neighborhoods are like they are. Some neighborhoods are fantastic, but most neighborhoods aren't. So I went around looking for new models of planning, knowing that we needed to think in systems, because every neighborhood, it's like genomics, like a genome. There's a code written into every neighborhood that gives instructions to get the outcomes that it gets. But it's a complex interdependent system, just like a genome with things being turned on and off. Everything is interdependent. We need, as I said, to get to the root causes of why people aren't healthy. We need to seek collective impact. We need to include the residents in every neighborhood, not just in the planning, but in the governance and decision-making in these neighborhoods. And I was looking for a planning protocol or a planning framework that would allow a backbone organization, some sort of resident-driven community organizing kind of backbone that would emerge in these neighborhoods. I was also really interested in tracking the data, seeing if we're making progress across sectors. I think too much, Cleveland and Northeast Ohio has probably one of the richest arrays of health data in the country. We have the best hospitals and we have the most amazing health data. But you can't only look at health data. You have to look across sectors, look at how health data intersects with data on poverty and data on education and data on job creation, transportation. And a planning framework that works at a neighborhood scale. Because if you're just looking at one site, or if you're looking at an entire city, can you really make change? A city, I think an entire city at one time might be too big, and one site is too small because it's not an entire system. So I found that planning framework. The EcoDistrict protocol was developed by an organization called EcoDistricts. EcoDistricts started in Portland about 11 years ago. It started in the city of Portland in the Office of Sustainability under a very progressive mayor who said, Portland is great at sustainability. It's kind of the poster child in the United States for sustainability. But this very progressive mayor said, we're doing great on sustainability, but Portland is becoming unaffordable. It's becoming mostly white. What can we do about that? So he charged his planning staff with coming up with a planning protocol that puts just as much emphasis on equity as on sustainability. That planning protocol was developed, then that group spun themselves off as a think tank, then they spun themselves off as a national foundation. And about 3 years ago, after doing pilot projects in the United States and the EU to test this model out, they issued the first official version of this planning protocol. I've been integrally involved in the development of the protocol and the implementation of the protocol. What's really interesting is, and I'm going to tell you more about it in a moment, what's really interesting is it originated on the West Coast, these coastal cities in the West, Portland, Seattle, but it's actually getting the most traction now in cities like Pittsburgh and Cleveland, because cities like Pittsburgh and Cleveland are really wrestling with issues of equity. Cleveland has a great history of progressive thought about equity and equity planning. We actually have a member of our audience who I can honestly say has been instrumental in moving that idea forward. Thank you, Bob. And Bob stands on the shoulders of Norm Krumholtz, who is one of the originators of this concept. So the protocol is a document that is both a management framework of how to do this, and it also is an international standard to make sure that we're doing this the right way and that we're trying to achieve excellence while achieving equity and sustainability. It's based on principles, and every good framework, I think, should be based on principles. It shouldn't be, here's exactly how to do it, although there is guidance in the protocol on how to do it. It's mostly based on principles, because every city is different, every neighborhood is different. The work that I'm doing in Slavic Village is different than the work that I'm doing in Clark Fulton. So it's based on principles. And I'm going to quickly run through 9 principles that I think are the most important. Number 1, I've alluded to this. We have to make collaboration completely inescapable in all the planning work that we do. I believe in my work that I'm a co-creator of plans with the people that I work with in the neighborhood. And also, as I alluded to, we should do it in a way that fosters a long-term approach to governance and decision-making. So the work that I'm going to describe to you that we're doing in the Clark Fulton neighborhood, we've actually developed a backbone organization of community stakeholders and residents who are all helping to make the decisions about the plan that we're coming up with. And by the way, that backbone organization will live on after the planners come up with the plan and exit. It will be an evergreen process. Number 2, I can't stress this more urgently. We have to design for the most vulnerable people, the people in these communities who don't usually have a place at the table. People of color, seniors sometimes don't have a seat at the table, and youth many times don't have a seat at the table. These are the people who are going to live in these neighborhoods, and they're not given a voice. And as I also alluded to, we have to address hard truths. Racism is real. Structural racism is real. The communities that I work in were the communities that were redlined in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. It was US policy to disinvest in the communities that I'm now trying to invest in. Number 3, we need to harden our infrastructure. We're going to see, on the coast, we're going to see more and more flooding. And in cities like Cleveland and Pittsburgh, we're going to see more and more high heat days and terrible cold days. By the way, in Pittsburgh, flooding is an issue as well because of all the development that's happened, all the tributaries that run into the 3 rivers overflow every time. There's rainy day flooding and sunny day flooding in Pittsburgh all the time. I also think, by the way, that we should fast-track community solutions to resilience. We're trying to set up, in the Clark Fulton neighborhood, we're trying to set up a fund to allow neighbors to propose resilience projects that our core group can fund and approve. Of course, we have to design with nature and natural systems. I think for too long, we've looked at natural systems as something that we have to overcome. And now I think we really have to design with them. We have to commit to zero carbon. Climate change is real. We have to radically reduce consumption. I think we have to radically reduce vehicle miles traveled in automobiles. And the EcoDistrict protocol talks about a systems approach to making that happen. As I said before, we have to make climate justice fundamental to what we do, because communities of color in fundamental ways are actually bearing the burdens of climate change more than white communities. Number 6, imagining the role of water. We think of water as something that's invisible. It sort of comes under the ground. We're not exactly sure where it comes, but it comes into our homes. Water is one of our most important resources. We should celebrate it and make it visible instead of invisible. And what the EcoDistrict protocol suggests is that neighborhoods could develop local water infrastructures. And that's happening in many of the cities that are doing EcoDistricts pilot projects. Number 7, and in Cleveland, since we're a healthcare leader, this is probably most important. Focus on health in everything that we do. There's a concept called health in all policies, which is very consistent with the EcoDistrict protocol. Every decision that we make around planning should think about how it impacts health, so that we can reverse this trend of health outcomes decreasing instead of increasing. We should make active design fundamental, but to make active design fundamental so that people use parks and recreation, we have to also make them safe. We have to reimagine, if we really want to decrease vehicle miles traveled, we have to really reimagine connectivity. We have to invest in public transportation, and we have to invest in human-centric street networks. Everybody drove here, including me, because that's the system that maybe some of you walked or took a bike or a scooter. But that's the system that we have. We need to change the system so it's easier for people to use bikes, scooters, or walk. And connectivity is not just physical connectivity. We want to connect people and institutions and people through physical connectivity. But the digital divide also hits communities of color in a very fundamental way. And if you don't have broadband wireless, or you don't have access, or you have wireless but you don't have access to it in your community, that also is a predictor of less health outcomes. It's been proven any number of times that if you have access to an online portal and your healthcare provider, your health outcomes are better. And then lastly, measuring our performance. In the Clark Fulton neighborhood, which I'll tell you about in a moment, we've developed over 100 indicators of performance that we're going to begin to measure. Some of them are health indicators, but we're also looking at indicators across sectors. And one of the important things that I also want to mention is what I've found in my work is that the data that we find through the sanctioned experts who who aggregate the data. Nothing against great research universities like Case that are doing this amazing data work. But you also have to look at the community wisdom in the community. And I'll give you an example. In one of the communities that I've been working in, we tried to aggregate the data to determine if this community was a food desert. Have you heard that term, food desert? Okay. And when we aggregated the data from the county, we determined, or the county determined, that this neighborhood was not a food desert because there were a number of retail food outlets, a certain number of retail food outlets within this geographic boundary. But we had been hearing from the residents that it was a food desert. So we did our own research. We actually talked to the residents, and we had the residents ground truth the data that we got from the county. What did we find out? Most of the retail locations on the county's data that said it was a food outlet was actually a liquor store. And they sold Twinkies, and they sold potato chips. Maybe they sold a loaf of white bread. But the county was counting those as retail food outlets. So all the work that we're doing in these neighborhoods, we're ground truthing the data to make sure that it takes advantage of the local wisdom. So we have time for conversation and questions. I'm going to very briefly tell you about the EcoDistrict protocol. If you have more questions about it, I'll stay afterwards. You could ask them, and if we don't get them answered, I'll stay afterwards. And then I want to tell you about this work that we're doing in Clark Fulton. So the EcoDistrict protocol is a very iterative process, and I don't like to show it as an organizational chart, but this is the most beneficial way to unpack it and show it so that you can understand it. It's based on the notion that at the bottom you have 20 or 25 objectives. And as a planner, that's always how I used to start. What are our objectives? What are we trying to accomplish? Do we want to highlight natural features? Do we want to make the street network more robust? We do that as part of the EcoDistrict protocol. But what the EcoDistrict protocol suggests is before you come up with objectives, you actually have to look at what are your priorities. And you have to look at the priorities across sectors. And those orange circles in the middle are the 6, you can do more, but EcoDistrict suggests that the minimum priorities should be 6 so that you capture the entire system. Place, prosperity, which is economic development and job creation, health and well-being, obviously, connectivity, both digital connectivity and physical connectivity, living infrastructure, in other words, how well are you connected to and making use of nature and natural systems, and resource regeneration is a fancy word for trying to develop a circular economy. And before you even look at the priorities, you have to commit yourself to what EcoDistricts calls imperatives. And those are the 3 at the top. Equity, resilience, and climate protection. EcoDistricts believes that if you don't start with that fundamental commitment to those North Star kind of principles, you can't really fully understand the priorities, and you'll never really fully understand your objectives. So the EcoDistrict protocol, you start from the top down. I think there are too many planning processes that start from the bottom up. Quickly, equity, which I think is incredibly important. posits the notion that cities that really focus on equity, that protect the people who are most vulnerable in the community and give them a role in the decision making, actually become the strongest communities. Resilience, I'm using the word resilience very broadly. A lot of people think about resilience just in terms of environmental resilience. How do we withstand heat waves and floods and hurricanes and all of the weird weather that we get because of climate change? That is a part of resilience. But resilience also means economic resilience and social resilience, because many of the shocks and stresses in our cities and neighborhoods are economic. Think about the mortgage crisis and how that devastated a community like Slavic Village, which I'm also working in. Those are the kind of things that we have to commit to protect the most vulnerable people in our communities. And climate. Climate, as I said, climate change is hitting the most vulnerable people in our cities and our neighborhoods the hardest. And look, if we don't solve the climate crisis in the next 10 years, it's going to impact everyone. So what are we doing in Cleveland? Cleveland is becoming a national leader in the EcoDistrict movement. I've been working in the city of Lakewood. City of Lakewood has adopted the EcoDistrict protocol, and I'm helping them rewrite their city master plan. Then I got a call from Metro Health. Metro Health, which is this hospital on the near west side, one of the 4 teaching hospitals for Case Western Reserve University, is doing a $1.3 billion campus transformation. And the CEO of Metro Health heard about EcoDistricts, he heard about my work, and given that their goal is to transform not just the neighborhood physically, but to make the neighborhood more healthy. And by the way, this is the Clark Fulton neighborhood where Metro Health sits, is the densest Hispanic population in the state of Ohio. He said, tell me more about EcoDistricts and how could that make the Clark Fulton neighborhood more healthy, more resilient, and more equitable. I told him about it. I don't know if any of you know Akram Boutros. He is an amazing leader. He is also an amazing decision maker. I think in about 12 minutes, he said, I get it. He says, we're doing this. We're going to do this. So I have a multi-year contract to advise Metro Health on how to not only change their campus to make their campus more sustainable as they build this new hospital, but how to make the entire community more sustainable, more resilient, more equitable, and more healthy. This is the Clark Fulton neighborhood. That's the boundary. You can see in the upper right-hand corner is downtown Cleveland. Upper left-hand corner is Lake Erie. That's the district that we've outlined, and we said within that district, which is a section of Ward 14 in the city of Cleveland, that's where we're going to focus. Hopefully we have an impact outside that boundary. Ideally we will. But if you're going to measure performance, you have to decide where you're going to measure it. So that roughly 3-acre geography on the near west side is where we're focusing. What we've done so far in Clark Fulton, we've finished and been approved for the first phase, which is the imperatives commitment. We spent a year trying to understand what does equity, resilience, and climate protection mean in Clark Fulton. I know what it means to me as a white 58-year-old Jewish architect, but that doesn't matter. What matters and what's relevant is what does that mean to the residents of Clark Fulton. We spent a year trying to understand that. we submitted our understanding to EcoDistricts, and we were approved to go on to the next phase towards certification. And now we're in the formation phase, where we've already established this organization of residents and community stakeholders to come together to plan the community. Right now, we're trying to understand the governance of how this body is going to make decisions on behalf of the neighborhood, and how those decisions will be understood in the neighborhood. By the way, a community where the majority speaks Spanish. It's another thing that we're wrestling with. By the way, after the formation phase, you go into what we call the roadmap phase, which is where we actually develop the plan. Then you become certified. And what I like about EcoDistricts is EcoDistricts believes that once you become certified, I don't know if anybody's familiar with rating credentials like LEED, which Helga indicated I'm also involved in. With LEED certification, you design a city or you design a building to meet that certification, and you meet it, and you get a plaque, and you're done. EcoDistrict says, no, when you get certification, you're just getting started. You have to measure your progress to achieve your goal, toward achieving your goals. And if you don't measure or you don't adapt based on what you find, you lose your certification. So certification is something that you have to continue to earn forever. By the way, in Clark Fulton, we're on phase 2. Now Slavic Village is engaged, my firm and I, to work with them on their community master plan. And the Slavic Village neighborhood is in phase 1. So, and I've had interest, emerging interest, in many neighborhoods in the city of Cleveland. So this is exciting. The Clark Fulton neighborhood, with Metro Health as its hospital anchor, is on track to become the first certified hospital-anchored eco-district in the world. We've been getting interest on what we're doing in Clark Fulton from all over the country. I went to a meeting in Chicago last month because the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation heard about our work and considered the work that we're doing at Metro Health one of the 10 cities in the United States, Cleveland, one of the 10 cities in the United States that's doing innovative work around health equity. And the beginning of January, I'm going to Los Angeles for another meeting because people want to hear about what we're doing in Cleveland. So I hope Helga, after a couple years maybe of doing this work, I want you to stay tuned. Hopefully Helga will invite me back and I can tell you more about the progress that we make. And thank you for your attention.
And now for your questions. This was very interesting, but one thing you didn't talk about, the lead poisoning. What does it take to clean a building? Can the people who live there do it themselves?
Great question, which I would expect from you. Do y'all know what the statistics are for Cleveland in terms of lead poisoning in Glenville? For children 6, what percentage do you think children 6 and under have been tested positive for lead poisoning in Glenville? 35%. 35%. I think the national average is 1.5%. So Mrs. Gold asked a very good question. Lead poisoning, lead is a environmental hazard that we actually know how to remediate. The science is actually proven. It just takes money and policy. And Cleveland actually is a national leader. We have a consortium that's looking at that. And you're right, I didn't mention it, but we are working with the Lead-Free Coalition in Cleveland to try and make sure that all of our plans in each of these neighborhoods includes lead remediation. Other questions? Yeah.
How are you intending to bring inclusion to the Metro Health neighborhood with the Hispanic community there? I know that they are very, in my experience, I worked at Metro Health for many years, are resistant to anything outside of their communities. I mean, they have Hispanic-speaking churches, schools. Many of the parents who are my age and younger do not speak English at all. And, you know, I wonder how they have a stake in this or how they understand the stake in it.
Great question, and it's a real issue. So I mentioned that we've been working in Clark Fulton now for a year. I think it's actually been a year and a half. The development, the creation of this first deliverable for the EcoDistrict protocol, committing to equity, committing to resilience, and committing to climate protection, that actually was not the hard part. The hard part is trust. The community, even though the hospital is their primary healthcare provider, the community doesn't trust the hospital. Most of what we did over the past 18 months is actually building trust. The way that we did that is it took 18 months, but we now have a group of leaders, including Jasmine Santana, who's the councilwoman, the first Latina councilwoman in the history of the city of Cleveland, who is a supporter of the work that we're doing, and she is an amazing leader, like unbelievable leader. So we knew that to have the community embrace what we're doing, we needed to have her embrace what we're doing. We have established a terrific relationship with the Community Development Corporation, Metro West, in the community. They have a Latinx executive director, a young guy who is unbelievable, Ricardo Leon. He, after lots and lots of conversations, he is now an adopter of what we're doing. The city of Cleveland it took a while, but the city of Cleveland has adopted what we're doing. The Cleveland Foundation is now a supporter, and Metro Health has always been a supporter. So that group of 5 is now considered, with 3 residents as well, is now considered the core steering committee. And every decision that we make about how we're going to reach out to the community is filtered through that steering committee, which includes an amazing councilwoman, an amazing Community Development Corporation. The language issue is one that we wrestle with for every meeting that we hold. We're actually, every communication that we develop, we have translated into Spanish.
I could thank you for your very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
I can see how the concept of eco-districts could be replicated in a place like Glenville or perhaps East Cleveland. But how do you get started? How do you get the funds? It must take some funds to get these projects started. And the funds, in some way or another, have to originate or be participated in by the community. How do you get a buy-in by the city government into a project like that? And is the same thing is true of private industry? How do you get it started with the proper funding by the parties that are of interest?
Okay, so So the basic answer to how to do it is really the same answer that I just gave. It's building understanding and building trust. Now, the funding is a different question. It just depends on how you want to use this planning protocol. And the planning protocol, so the planning protocol is open source. Anybody could download it. We think that it's been downloaded 8,000 times, and we think that there are 700 cities across the world that are using the planning protocol in some way or another. The vast majority of those 700 are probably just, saying, let's try this, let's do this. They have their own planning staff in their city, or it's a group of community organizers. They say, this sounds good. This is like a box of common sense. Let's just try it. There are 18 cities in the United States that have gone the extra mile and said, we're going to seek certification. Cleveland is only one of those cities that actually has 2 eco-districts seeking certification, Clark Fulton and Slavic Village. And seeking certification does take more manpower. It takes more effort. You don't have to have an eco-district professional, an expert like me, but you can, people in the community can get the credential as well. I'll tell you 2 opposite ends of the spectrum. In Cleveland and Clark Fulton, Metro Health believes in this. The Cleveland Foundation believes in this. The city of Cleveland believes in this. They've allocated funds. Metro Health is supporting it. The Mayor's Transformation Initiative, Mayor Jackson's Mayor's Transformation Initiative is supporting it, and the Cleveland Foundation is supporting it. If you really want to make this happen, it does take funding, but the outcomes should validate and give you a return on investment. So it's a fairly easy. It's a considerable amount of support, but it's fairly easy to make the argument. But the other end of the spectrum, the first neighborhood, actually it's a municipality, small municipality in the city of Pittsburgh that actually achieved certification. So of those 18 neighborhoods or cities or neighborhoods within cities that are seeking certification, so far one has been certified. It's the borough of Etna, which is right outside of Pittsburgh. It's all grassroots. They're doing the whole thing with volunteers. There's young architects that live in Etna that are working on it. The municipality got a grant for a Vista AmeriCorps intern. So I think that's the only expense. They got certification just with a grassroots effort. So you can actually do it both ways. The protocol actually is adaptable in that way. Does that make sense? Yeah, Candy.
When you say that people expect a return on their investment, what does that return look like?
Well,
the prices of houses go up in that neighborhood. Is there a return on investment, or does it?
okay, so that's yeah, that's actually a very complicated question because we do like the idea of investment in the community and rising housing prices, but we're also very wary of displacement. That's what's happened in Tremont. So just north of Clark Fulton, you have a community which has seen a tremendous amount of investment, and people of moderate and low income were actually pushed out. So we absolutely don't see return on investment as specifically just that metric of increased housing prices. This is actually a good example of unintended consequences and and how you really have to look across a system to judge if you're meeting these imperatives of equity, resilience, and climate. So why would Metro Health do this? Metro Health, I think, is actually the leader in the state of Ohio, and I think it's maybe the 10th best in the United States around accountable care and trying to reduce their costs and the cost of care by using population health, trying to make the community healthier to reduce their costs. And there are incentives that the government has instituted to incentivize that. And Metro Health is a leader in that, and I think they see this as an opportunity to just continue that work. So their return on investment is reducing the cost of care to take care of more people.
One more question.
How would you measure that?
Yeah, so Metro Health is already measuring that because,
Cost of care.
Okay,
Does it mean less funds coming
sorry.
to the hospital, right?
no, but measure, you know, the, I don't know if it's part of the Affordable Care Act or Medicare or Medicaid, but this accountable care, being an accountable care organization, they're already measuring health outcomes to show, because the government mandates that. So that's actually the easy part. I think measuring the more qualitative aspects of health is more difficult.
Did you
I'm
notice
Sorry.
Today's newspaper. An
Excuse me.
article, Clark Fulton was awarded $3.4 million. That was today's Plainview. For development.
Right, they got a historic tax credit allocation from the state to build affordable housing in an abandoned building. That's right,
That's part of what you're trying to do.
exactly, yes.
I think we're going to
No.
have to.
Oh,
Can you take one more?
a family friend, you have to.
Perhaps some of you heard recently that our city of Cleveland is one of the most dangerous in the country to live in and to drive in. Anybody hear that? Okay. So I was particularly interested in your remark about the woman who was afraid to go to the public park. Okay, so maybe a good thing to consider, in addition to all these ecological changes, which are wonderful, is for cities to adopt, I think they can do this on an individual basis, strict laws against texting while driving. That might help. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. The other one, on a much broader basis, is gun control, because obviously you know what that causes. So that's my take on it. Thank you.
Okay, so Marcia, that's a good, I agree with everything that you said. However, it's a great example of why it's so important to think about root causes. Because gun violence, to really solve the issue of gun violence, you have to look at the root causes. It's systemic, it's intergenerational, and unless we work on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis, looking at the entire system, you're absolutely right, as long as it's part of the entire system. Good.
I might tell you, I worked for gun control back in the 70s, a grassroots lobbying group. We did some good things. It's a very complicated, very difficult issue. And amongst all the others, it should be looked at. Anyway, thank you so much, Irwin, for a
you.
most interesting program.